Hey, what's up? Andrew Kramer here, and welcome to another very exciting tutorial. Today we're going to take a look at compositing 3D objects into live action footage. So here's our original footage. We've got this nice parking garage, and now we've got an armored truck. And one of the things that makes this look so realistic is that it's not parked perfectly. See, it's off center, and that just, those imperfections, they go a long way. What is this guy thinking? He must be thinking, which means it's real. Makes you think. No, it doesn't. But we're going to take a look at this example. We're going to take a look at how this technique can be used for all sorts of things, like titles, of course. Just any kind of 3D object. You don't want to park in that spot, obviously. And, as well as doing some fake shadows. So Element can do some sort of soft shadows with the ambient occlusion, but we're going to take a look at adding some hard shadows that just make objects look a little bit more realistic. And it's going to be a lot of fun. We're also going to be taking a look at the camera tracking tool built into CS6, as well as the camera tracker plugin from the Foundry. So we're going to take a look at those two options, and let's jump right in. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to 3D camera track this. So we're going to choose Window, Tracker, and this is only in CS6, but if you're using a previous version, there's other tracking tools out there, like Buju and some of these other ones. I recommend the After Effects plugin Camera Tracker from the Foundry. It's got a lot of great capabilities, but we're in CS6, so we'll just use the Track Camera feature. So we click that, and it's going to start analyzing in the background. So it's going to process everything. You can see some information here. All right, so the 3D camera tracker has finished processing. It's got all these little dots everywhere. And what we need to do is create a camera from all of this data. So what we can do is if you put your mouse into the scene, you see it triangulates a flat position. So let's say we want our truck to be here. I want to use these 3 points to triangulate that position on the ground. So in other words, just click on the ground, right click, and choose Create Null and Camera. Or we could even do Create Solid and Camera. So now we have this solid. If we hit S, we could scale it up, and you can see that represents the ground. We could even do something like grid, put the grid effect on there. And you can see that that is looking pretty good. Now, in this case, we have a flat surface, but let's say we wanted to connect a 3D object or a text or something to other positions. Well, what you want to do is click on the effect name, and then just click on the different points, right click, and choose Create Null. And a null object will be created in that position. So here it is right there. We could go through and just add some additional data that we may want to use. So for example, I could shut this grid off. And let's say we want to add a point to this position. So we'll choose Create Null. We'll come over here, maybe here, Create Null. And maybe this one here, we'll right click and choose Create Null. So I'm just trying to create some information. So if we click away, we still have all of these nulls in our scene. So they're in 3D space. And the great thing is now we know the actual position of this null object, because if we hit P, it's whatever the position of this is. So we could do things like place objects exactly in that position because we know exactly where that is. All right, so this is the basic idea. But if I were to create a new null object and make it 3D, and then if I move my camera around, you can see that null object is floating in the air, and now we're way past it, and it's no longer helpful to us because it's too close to where the camera is. So what I would like to do is adjust my scene coordinates so that the null object or the center of my After Effects scene is in a little bit more of a useful location, like around where we want to work. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how to take all of the data of our scene and make it a little bit more manageable. So here's what we're going to do. Let's delete that null, and we're going to create another null object. We're going to make it 3D, hit F4 to toggle the switch, make it 3D, and then take all of the null objects and the camera, hold down Shift, select them all, and then parent them to the null object. And then we're going to come over here to the active camera and change it to the top view. Then if we turn on our title action safe, we can see there's this little plus sign. That is the center of our scene, of our world. And if I zoom out here a bit, we can see the null objects that we created earlier. And instead of them being really close to the center of our scene, they're way off in the distance. So what I want to do is bring them in a little bit closer. So here's how we'll do that. We'll take our null object, hit S, and then scale it down. And so you can see that the camera is moving in, and so are the null objects. So check that out. We're kind of moving everything in equal distance to that center point. So we'll bring it in nice and close, maybe 5 or 10%. 5% looks pretty good, depending on where your points are and such. And then I'm going to take the null and move the position so that the points in my scene are around this center point. And remember, this is the top view, but let's also look at the front view and make sure these points line up as well. So here's another tricky part. So let's go back to the active camera. We can see that these points are all perfectly where they need to be. So everything lines up nicely. We haven't changed any of the relative values. But what I do want to do is take this null object, and this null object, and make sure my ground plane is perfectly flat. In other words, when we add stuff into our scene, we want to make sure that it lines up perfectly flat. So if you have 3 points that are on the same flat plane, what we can do is go to the front view, and we can see those 3 points, and we can also see that they don't line up. So if we were to turn on the title safe, even hit Control R, we can bring up the ruler and just align it right with this plus sign. Remember, that's from the title safe, and that's showing us sort of the middle of our scene. And what I want to do is move these points up. So we're going to move them up by moving this null object, and we're going to line them up. So we've got 2 of them to line up, but the third one, not quite. So what we want to do is hit R, and we just want to rotate the scene. So if we rotate, hold down Control. See, that's not good. We rotate it down, and check this out. They're almost lining up perfectly. So then we can go and move this back up. Maybe adjust it a bit more. Move this back up. And we just need to, tweak the settings here. So you can rotate this a little bit and play around with the different coordinates until you get it just right. So now it's going to be pretty close, and I just need to rotate it on the Z a little bit. So now that's pretty good. Now, you may not be able to get it perfect every time, but the closer it is to this flat plane, the better and easier it's going to be to put things into your scene that are 3-dimensional. So let's go ahead, jump out of the active camera, and take our null object, and let's just delete that. Hide the title safe and get rid of that ruler. And now let's go ahead and add some stuff into our scene. All right, so the 3D tracker that comes with After Effects CS6 works pretty good. Now, if you're running into some trouble where you're not able to get a good solid track, or things are kind of bouncing around, you might want to check out the Camera Tracker tool from the Foundry, which is a separate plugin, but works very similarly. So I can kind of show you that really quick. It's called Camera Tracker, and it's just got some other great options. So it's got a matte source. So what you can do is you can block out people or things that are moving in your scene that may mess up your tracking data. You can also input some camera information like the focal length and things to get a more accurate track. So if you're finding you're having a little bit of trouble, you're not getting the results that you need, check that out. I get some really good results with that. So let's go and move on to adding some 3D objects into our scene. Now, we're going to be using Element 3D from Video Copilot. This is a great site. I recommend it. And we're going to do Effect, Video Copilot, Element. And what we're going to do is jump into the scene, and we could go and we could add any 3D object. I'm just going to go into My Models, and I've got an object called a truck. And we'll go and load that. Now, this particular model is like 2 million vertices, 600,000 polygons. So it's a pretty large object, but it looks pretty nice. Now remember, when you open up objects in Element from a 3D program, they actually come in white. So they'll come in looking just like this. And all you have to do is take your textures, your UV textures, and go to the different channels and just turn them on and off until you find the one you're looking for, and then just drop the textures right into the slots and basically just rebuild them. And it takes a couple of minutes, but once you're done, you can save it as a model preset, and then you don't have to do it again. So in this case, I've already got it all set up. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to do first. First, it's on group 1. So that's important. We want to make sure that our truck is on group 1. The other thing is we want to try to match the environment reflection for the scene of the parking garage. So if we go into the environment, we can actually check out some of these different options. So there's one called the garage, and that one works pretty good. Now, there's also one called Studio Warm that has some nice warm tones which kind of match our scene inside of the After Effects side. So what I may want to do is go into the environment and maybe lower the saturation just a little bit and hit OK. And then if I right click and drag, we can see how the reflection affects our object. So it looks pretty nice. You can also hold down Alt and left click and drag and orbit around your model. So you can really kind of get a good sense for how things look. And you can tell this is a pretty high quality model. If we turn off draft textures, and these are really large, you can see we've got some really great detail, and the specular map looks very realistic. So very cool way of bringing in some good solid looking models. Now this is really important. I want this object to be on the ground surface. So I want the anchor point to be the bottom of the truck. So if we click on the object, we can come over here to the transform, and the anchor point is set to the bottom. So I've already added that into my object before I saved it, but you just want to make sure it's set to the bottom so that your object will lie flat on the surface. So we'll hit OK. And we've got our truck here. Now here's something cool. Before we do anything, our object is kind of rotated awkwardly. So what if we went into the particle look, brought the size down, and then created another new null object? And check this out. We're going to make it 3D. And just like before, we're going to take all the track points, hold down Shift, and the camera, and parent it to that null. And then we're going to rotate the null. And now what we've done is we've made it so that all of the objects that come into our scene align perfectly, perpendicular to where everything is. I can even take this and move it. So even though the null doesn't move, we're actually moving the camera and everything around our world space. We can even scale it up and change the scale of our scene. So we're only changing this null, but it changes everything around it. So that looks pretty good. We'll go ahead, delete that null, and just start working. So we can come into group 1 where our truck is, and we can rotate it around. Maybe we'll rotate it, and we can go to the particle replicator and move it. So we can maybe move it back a little bit. Now be careful, you don't want to change the XY position because that's going to make it go down below our floor plane. And in order for it to look like it's sitting on the surface, we need to make sure that those 2 points connect. So watch this. If we make it high, it'll kind of look like it's floating in the air. So we don't want that, or maybe we do. It could be awesome, a flying armored truck. That'd be a difficult heist to pull off, no doubt. But I'm sure Mark Wahlberg and his gang could do it in their Mini Coupes. So this is good, but we also want to create some shadows that are on our ground surface. So Element doesn't currently cast shadows from lights, but it does have ambient occlusion that creates some really nice soft shading that we can integrate in our shot. So instead of trying to explain this, let me just jump in and show you. What we have is our truck. It's on group 1. Well, I'm going to come over here to the model browser. We're going to go to the primitives, and we're going to come down here to the plane, click on it, and just drag down. It's invisible underneath to make it faster. All right, so we've got this flat plane. What we can do is put it onto group 2, and take it off group 1 and then hit OK. So now we have a flat surface in our scene. We can go into group 2, particle look, turn up the size so that it covers our whole entire surface. We can even move it around by adjusting the replicator position. So now that that is in place, we can come down to the render settings and we have ambient occlusion. So if we turn that on, we add some nice shading into our scene. So turn up our resolution. So we have a little bit of shading underneath our wheels. We can even turn up the radius and even the samples so that it's a little bit smoother. And we can turn up the intensity and it looks pretty good. However, it's on this blue surface. So how can we get rid of that? Well, we go into the scene setup. We've got an option specifically for this case. So if we click on the material, scroll down to the advanced options and turn on matte shadow. So now it's invisible and it warns you, hey, it's invisible. So if you can't see it, it's because it's invisible, right? So we'll hit OK. And so now it disappeared and we still have some nice shading. Now, we have to be careful. You don't want to turn this up too much. You want to just use it to create a little bit of contact for your objects. And, it's not going to be the perfect solution, but it looks pretty good and it can really make your objects look more realistic. But we still want to create a more substantial shadow underneath the tires. But before we do that, let me show you something interesting about the matte shadow object. So it's invisible, but if we move our objects down, it can actually be used to obscure things. So you can use that matte shadow to hide things, to block things. And, for example, if I made an object that was a box that aligned perfectly with this pillar, I can actually use it to obscure things in 3D space. So there's some fun opportunities to use that. And, it's a really handy tool. So let's go and move on to creating the shadow. We're going to be using a technique similar to the particle shadows tutorial. So I recommend you check this out. For a few more advanced tips, I'm just going to show you the basics right now. So one thing we could do is we could just create a black solid, hit OK, and make it a 3D layer, rotate it so that it's flat, put it underneath, and we could use the pen tool and we could probably create a decent looking shadow. We could hit F, feather it out a bit, and maybe even, add some more detail for the wheels and stuff. And this would actually work pretty well. So even if I took off the ambient occlusion, maybe expand that mask a little bit. This could actually work pretty well. With a little bit of work, we could, make it more detailed. We could lower the opacity and keep the ambient occlusion on. But if we want to create a more accurate shadow or we have a more complex scene, here's what we need to do for that. So we have our element layer set up. So we'll type element. So what we do is animate everything and then take our layer and duplicate it. So edit, duplicate, and then we're going to pre-compose it. So we're going to choose a layer, pre-compose, and move all the attributes. So we'll call this element shadow and hit OK. Then we're going to double click on the comp and then go into element. So we need to clear out our scene. So we're going to get rid of that ground plane. And instead of using all of the materials, we're going to create a new material from the material area. And we're just going to drop this onto our object and it's going to replace all the materials with this one material. And then we're going to change it to just being white and then go down to the illumination and then turn the intensity up to 100. So we just created a flat white material and I'll hit OK. So now what I'm going to do is create a new camera. And we want it to be kind of a long lens, so like 200 millimeter, hit OK. And then we're going to take the camera orbit tool and we want to orbit so that we're right above the bottom of our object. So wherever the object comes closest to our surface. Then we're going to take the camera, hit R, and let's rotate this so that it fills up the space. We could hit AA, hold down shift, zoom this in a bit. You know, we could even just use the camera tool and, you know, move things in. Cool. You want to make sure there's a little bit of space around the outside. And then what we're going to do is come down here to the render settings. We'll shut off the ambient occlusion. And we're going to go to the fog and turn it on. Turn up the opacity 100% and set the range to -100. So we're kind of creating a reverse fog. So then we're going to turn the distance up, and you can hold down shift until it disappears. And then when it disappears, try to find the position where it's right about where the wheels get wiped out. So then what I'm going to do is create a white solid and put it at the bottom here. So what we've done is we've created a snapshot of the areas that are touching the ground. So in this case, the wheels are darker because they're actually touching the ground. And then we have the, you know, the undercarriage and other parts that are kind of gray. So that's the basic idea of what we need to create a nice looking shadow. So we can do something like this. We could duplicate the element layer, hit F4, set it to multiply, and then we could maybe even make this a little bit blurry, so we could add a fast blur and turn up the blurriness and even extend the distance a bit so that it creates a softer shadow. So we just turn that up. We might even take the bottom layer and blur it out a little bit as well. So we could just add a fast blur. And so this is the basic idea of creating the shadow. So then if we go back into our comp, we can turn our layer into a 3D layer, take the rotate tool and rotate it, put it underneath the element layer. And then let's go to the top view really quick. And then we can see our truck here and we can rotate it a little bit easier. So we'll rotate this around, line it up, hit S, scale it down. Scale it down a little bit more here. So there we go. You can just hit escape or just go back to active camera and then set the transfer mode of the shadow to multiply. And then we can take a curves adjustment and just, you know, adjust the brightness of the shadow or, you know, change how intense it looks. So we can bring it up a bit and maybe even blur it out some more so that it's nice and soft, and we can even lower the opacity. So this is where you can really just dial it in perfectly, and there we go. We've got some nice shadow. So let's go and take a look at setting the lighting up for this truck, because hey, we want this to look good, right? So here's what we're going to do. Let's create a new light. So I want to create an ambient light that is similar to the room color. So we'll set it to about 30 and change it to an ambient and hit OK. So that's going to start giving us the color we need in our scene. Now our shadow layer is now being affected. So what I want to do is hit AA and shut accept lights to off. And another thing to keep things moving fast inside of this world, not that element is affected by this, but just 2D layers like planes can actually be slowed down if you're using the ray trace renderer. So if you're only doing simple things like 2D layers and using element, then you probably want to have this set to classic 3D so that you're not wasting resources rendering, you know, ray traced planes or something like that. So FYI. All right, so we've added our ambient light. So that's going to just start getting things to look right. Now I want to create a light that's coming from this back area, for example. So somewhat of a bright white light. So we'll create a parallel light that's white. And then what we want to do is move the position of the light. So hit P. I just like to hold down Shift and move lights until they're in the position that I like them. So we can see now that it's kind of coming from overhead here, and that's looking good. We just want to shift it. There we go. And then we'll hit T, bring up the intensity. Now, the other thing that's important is the reflection map. So if we go into element, we can actually come down to the render settings and adjust the environment all by itself. So if we go into the rotate environment, we can rotate it until we get like a nice highlight. And what that's going to do is just make your scene more realistic, because then you're going to say, oh wait, that looks like it's reflecting. Even if it's not a real ray trace reflecting, you want it to kind of give you some of those cues that make you feel like you're really seeing, reflectivity or whatever. So that's a nice touch there. All right, so another thing here is we've got some of these lights that are creating some orange light. So let's create a couple of point lights, and we'll use this kind of warm color here, and turn up the intensity around 100. And we'll find the position of that light. One thing we could do is we could take one of these nulls, hit P, copy the position, and then paste it into the light's position. So now the light's right there, and then we can move it up, and it's a lot easier to find that, where we want it. So now we can see the highlights on the hood. Can, hit T, brighten this up a bit. We could create another light up here. We just want to make things look like they're integrated. So that's pretty good for the lighting. And we might even turn up the ambient light just a touch. But now we want to do a little color correction. So we'll take our object, our element scene object, and we'll choose Effect, Color Correction, Curves, and let's try to match our plate. So I'm going to add a little bit of red. So that's good. And then I want to go to the blue channel and bring the blue down just a bit. So we don't want to overdo it, but we're just trying to get it to look a little bit more real. Now, the blue on this is just really, really strong. So let's just add some specific color correction, like a hue and saturation. We'll even put this before the curves and go to the blue channel and bring that down, and then bring the lightness down too, so it looks like it's integrating. Cool. So then let's go back to the curves and maybe tweak the settings a bit more. So that looks pretty good right there. And we could spend some more time, tweaking lights, and we could even go into element, go to the output, multi-pass, and we could turn up the specular. We could turn up the reflectivity amount, and we can make those kinds of adjustments to make the scene look, really nice. All right, so this is how you can do some really impressive stuff right inside of After Effects using Element 3D. And you notice that we set up our scene data really nicely, so that when we were moving the shadow around and we were placing objects, it was very easy, and we didn't have to deal with, moving things around to get them to align perfectly to some crazy world space. So spend a little time in the beginning to make sure your tracking data is, solid, and just makes everything a lot easier later on. Now, just a quick reminder, this week we're coming out with a new update for Element that's going to include some really cool new features. One of them is some improved sampling and anti-aliasing. Right now we have multi-sampling, and this is hardware-based anti-aliasing. This looks pretty good, but some cards are only limited to 16 or 8, and in some cases, like if you have a really high detail model, like this particular truck, you need even more control. So we've added a new feature called super sampling, which adds even greater control over smoothing out edges and getting rid of flicker or things like that. In this really thin edge right here, we can see that it breaks up just a little bit. So if we look at some of these edges, you can see it's just a little bit choppy. And what we can do is turn on super sampling to say 2. And now we have a much smoother edge. So let's snapshot this and go back to 0. And if we look right here, we can see that things get a lot better with the 2x super sampling. So if we turn that on, and the great thing is it doesn't slow stuff down that much. We can still scrub through our scene, and the render time is just a little bit more. But what's nice is you can just turn it off while you work, get your scene set up, get it all lit, make everything look nice, and just like a 3D program, you can just turn the quality up when you're ready to render the final shot. So that is the new feature of Element that's going to be coming in an update soon. Now, if you want to take it to the next level, here's some other cool ideas. So in this particular shot, we can see we freeze the frame, we sort of have the wheel fly off, and I'm actually using some clips from Action Essentials 2 composited with the truck. So if we take a look at how that's set up, I can show you the basic idea. So see some debris bits. And if we jump inside the scene setup, we can take a look at how that's set up. So we have this floor fracture object, and this object is part of the starter models. It's basically a flat plane that's pre-fractured. So if we look at the wireframe, you can see it's broken up into chunks, and that's on group 4. And then we've also separated out the back tires onto group 3. And the way I've done that is I've just separated the materials that represent those tires, and then on the truck example, or the main truck, we actually have that tire missing. So when they're on group 2 and the wheels on group 3, those two pieces will essentially come together as one, and then we can go to group 3 and animate the position individually to sort of fly off. So for example, I could take, the position of it, move it around, and, time the animation so that it goes flying off in whatever direction that we want. Now, the other thing is that we've got some lights here to simulate the fire. And so we have a light there, we have a light coming from underneath, and just one more bright one. And what's nice about this is we can see some nice reflectivity. Now, as far as compositing the elements, we're using Action Essentials 2. So I've used the car bomb, and basically you just take it and position it into 3D space. So we've made it a 3D layer, and we've also made it so that the accept lights option is off, and that way it's not affected by all the lights in our scene. And we put a few in 3D space. We can move these around so there's a little parallax, and then we've got little bits of fire there, and then some dust that somewhat gets frozen as it comes out. And I've just done a simple time remap. For a little more information about creating an explosion, I would say check out the blast wave tutorial and some cool tips for compositing explosions and stuff. So that one's got some good tips, and even the depth charge, we talk about, some stock footage. So, and then we've just got some, our color correction and some glows so that the explosion, looks nice with everything else. So, but the cool thing is it's 3D, so you get that nice parallax. And by the way, for the chunks, the debris bits, all I did was on group 4, we put the the brick piece, and what I've done is I've enabled multi-object. So when you turn on the multi-object, it turns all of those pieces into small chunks, and then you can do things like scatter those pieces around. So nothing too fancy, but just a quick animation from them being off and really small to sort of just blowing out and stopping. So, just experiment with that. All right, so hopefully that helps you get started with your own time freeze explosion comp. And hopefully this tutorial has given you some new ideas to use the plugin, and I can't wait to see what everyone creates with it. My name is Andrew Kramer. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.